During the development of Pokemon Gold and Silver, many different concepts were considered. Everything from a map that resembled the whole of Japan to many different cut Pokemon. Amongst these varied changes were a number of cut characters and cut character roles. For one, Professor Oak was to have a much bigger role back then as the main professor of the game instead of Professor Elm. However, where there is light, there is dark, and a surprise villain was also set to appear, known as Imposter Professor Oak. Yes, that Imposter Professor Oak from the card game. But what was he originally set to do in this case, and why was he even here? Today on Cut Content, we investigate the cut Imposter Professor Oak from Pokemon Gold and Silver. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and hit the notification bell too to further support us and keep creating new videos. To begin, Imposter Professor Oak is found within the 1997 build of the game within the city of High Tech. Inside one of the homes was a woman on the left, but on the right is the sprite we are looking for. Looking a lot like the traditional sprite of Professor Oak, except with some obvious differences. These include having rather pronounced eyebrows, spiked hair, and a bigger collar. These obvious differences are the exact same ones seen within the card game's version of him. But what does this all mean? Well, it's our first step into this investigation. Now, the leaked 97 build was an incomplete game, so there wasn't any text or story that directly discusses who this imposter is. But there is a lot of evidence with what is available that might give us a better idea about his character, what he is doing here, and what his plans may even be. Now for that, we need to look at the original Professor Oak himself. Professor Oak is found within the starting town of Silent Hill in that game. As mentioned earlier, he serves as the professor instead of Professor Elm. Our first piece of evidence comes from the very first room in the game with this radio here. If you flip it on, the radio reports that Professor Oak is missing, with the broadcast stating, "Now listening to JOPM, the Pokemon broadcast station, will now present Pokemon news. World-renowned Pokemon researcher reported missing from Kanto." Some suspect Professor Oak may have simply left for a new place to study, but we can't yet disprove that foul play may have been involved. Concerned parties are very worried. Now, one might surmise that if Oak is missing, but he is in this very lab in this town, that maybe this is actually his imposter before he becomes more disheveled. But that's not so true, as Oak himself states, "Therefore I moved from Kanto to here, Silent Hill, in order to establish a new laboratory." But the idea of him missing is the key here. Outside of the very trusting town of Silent Hill that apparently can keep secrets, Oak is MIA. So if someone did want to disguise as him and go around saying that they are Professor Oak, people could believe it since the real Oak won't stand up. I mean, the one house you do find him in amongst the maps is inside the house of someone. I mean, I can't imagine that he was let in by this woman because she thought that this was the famous Professor Oak coming to visit. So in this case, if we have an imposter Professor Oak running around because no one is there to stop him, what are his intentions? Considering how Pokemon tends to make obviously evil characters look evil in their artwork, it can be safe to assume that the imposter was not meant to be a good guy. Was he just another plot point character that randomly was going around to sabotage Oak's reputation? Or did he work for someone? Well, for this, let's look at the Pokemon trading card game. Now I know that's not normally a good place to look for evidence, but let's consider the facts here. The Pokemon trading card game officially started in October of 1996, 1 year after Generation 1 started and 1 year before the 1997 build of Gold and Silver were made. Back then, when we saw an Imposter Professor Oak card amongst the very first booster set, many of us didn't even consider the idea of him originating from the video games and just thought of him as a card only. Now, one thing we do know is that the Pokemon Company tends to tip off other Pokemon mediums such as the anime well in advance of their plans for the upcoming games. I mean, Ho-Oh literally shows up in the first episode of Pokemon after all, and thus this would explain why this is an exact match for a sprite in the game too. But what we want to look at is not this card, but the other two cards, starting with this card here, Imposter Oak's Revenge. Now there are two major indicators that hint to his allegiance. The first being marked with this R here on the bottom, showing that this card is from the Team Rocket booster set. This set specifically had cards entirely based off of Team Rocket, and every character that appears in it is a part of Team Rocket too. So it makes sense for him to also actually be with Team Rocket here too. To add to that value, he is accompanied by 2 poison type Pokemon here, which is a typing that Team Rocket tends to use a lot. Maybe they were even thinking of making him fightable, and these were going to be part of his roster. But that isn't enough evidence to say for sure. Heck, even that one time in the anime when Imposter Professor Oak appeared, he actually was Team Rocket's James in disguise the whole time. Thus, Team Rocket's connection continues. But that whole setup in the anime is interesting to say the least, as this might be what leads into his entire purpose. Now, within the 97 build, it is very clear that the Team Rocket takeover of the radio tower still happens. The radio tower, in fact, may be our key to coming up with a theory here with 2 major events to form it. The first is that within the final game, Professor Oak has a radio show that one can tune into. The other being how the radio tower director was kidnapped and impersonated. Now, because the whole radio tower plus the Team Rocket takeover existed since 97, it is possible that these other 2 events may have existed to an extent back then too. But obviously it couldn't be as is since the actual Professor Oak was missing. So what if it was actually Imposter Professor Oak who suddenly started to go in and do radio broadcasts while pretending to be the real Oak? Not only would this fill in the Oak show, but also the subplot of the radio tower director being impersonated too. It is as such possible that the imposter was used to create an opening within the tower for Team Rocket to invade and take it over, while also broadcasting messages that might gather the whole team together and revive it once more. As I mentioned earlier, the anime might even somewhat support this too, as the episode on Imposter Professor Oak involved the imposter pretending to be Oak and doing Oak's show live. This together with Jessie disguised as DJ Mary too to make this possible in the anime. Now, while this is a theory here, one other addition I have for this is that it is possible that the imposter also had some sort of vendetta against the real Oak, and thus why he agreed to team up with Team Rocket. I mean, if you look at these 2 cards of him, one shows him as a clear inventive genius still too, and not just some rocket grunt dressed up as Oak, while the other speaks of revenge. Maybe the idea was that he was once a former colleague of Oak who was rejected due to his maniacal inventions and wanted to ruin Oak's reputation this way by making it look like he is working with Team Rocket the whole time. But while there are a lot of little things spread out through the games, the TCG, and even the anime that might give us an idea of who he was, this was a theory that I put together based on all that. Is this all correct? Well, that is very hard to say for sure. Some things like the Team Rocket connection can be very possible, while the whole idea of him being a mole within the tower is not so sure of a theory. But overall, this is one very fascinating character that we unfortunately may not ever know what his whole story was truly going to be, unless more documentation one day is released telling us directly his whole plot point. And if that happens, I'll definitely plan to be here to cover it, so hit the subscribe button, for I'll plan to be back with more Pokemon and other games cut content soon. Hit the like button and comment below on what you think Imposter Professor Oak's purpose was going to be. So everyone, thank you for watching!